Hello, my name is Wendy Marsh. I'm here to talk about a form of research that begins where most methods can't go. Autoethnography can reach inside a life, inside memory, inside the experience of growing up through a difficult childhood and what it takes to come through it. It's not a limitation of this methodology, it's its greatest strength. I want to establish something at the outset because it matters for everything that follows in this presentation. I spent over 40 years in classrooms. I was an early childhood educator and I was an elementary and secondary school teacher. I'm not a detached observer of childhood adversity. I'm someone who lived it, survived it, and dedicated my career to understanding it. Those experiences inform my view of the world. I believe reality isn't fixed. It's informed by context, by relationships, and by the generational histories we hold. Knowledge emerges from that lived experience, from the themes that repeat themselves across a lifetime, from human connection. So I didn't begin with a hypothesis and then test it. I began with an experience and built understanding from there. So what I've lived, I've brought to this research. What I experienced as a child, I've rendered symbolically in my illustrations. And the theoretical analysis of that material is my thesis. Land acknowledgements situate the researcher. They remind us that knowledge grows from particular places, particular histories, and particular relationships. I've written much of this thesis on the ancestral homelands of the Tequesta, the Calusa, and today the Seminole and Miccosukee tribes of Florida. I pay my respects to the elders for their ongoing sovereignty, history, and land stewardship, past and present, and I hold that responsibility in this work. I also want to acknowledge that I do much of my studying and my writing on the ancestral homelands of the Mississauga of Scugog Island First Nation. The Anishinaabe people, Algonquin, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, have cared for this land since long before the arrival of settler societies. The shared history and the obligations of the Williams Treaties belong to all of us, and so does the responsibility to understand them. Our past defines our present, but it doesn't have to define our future. That's true for nations, but it's true for children too. And in many ways, it's the central argument of this thesis. The land acknowledgements aren't a preamble. They remind me that knowledge emerges from particular histories, particular relationships, and the specific circumstances of a researcher's life. My methodological choices reflect exactly that understanding. What follows isn't a list of procedures. It's more an account of how I came to the choices I made as a researcher. I'll explain illustrated narrative autoethnography and why I chose it. I'll show how the research design aligns with Prisma principles to create rigor. And I'll talk about what this approach does well, what it can't do, and why at this particular moment in education, it matters. Let me take you back to where this began, because the method didn't come first, the question did. When I first began to articulate my thesis idea, I knew what I needed to explore. I wanted to understand how children living with adverse childhood experiences struggle to engage with learning. And I wanted to know explicitly whether strong teacher-student relationships, mindfulness, social-emotional skills, and executive functioning instruction could help kids work around trauma, build their identity, and eventually find a way to survive and thrive. These are known as protective factors, and they're at the heart of this thesis. When autoethnography was suggested and I read about the method, two things became clear. My own history wasn't a liability, it could be used as data, and my illustrations weren't supplementary, they were primary. Autoethnography suits this research because trauma isn't something you can measure from the outside without deeper investigation. It's lived. It's felt in children's bodies, in their capacity to pay attention, and in their ability to manage their emotions. In my case, trauma was understood by looking inward, carefully and temporally over time, and then holding up what I found against what research already shows. Autoethnography has been part of the scholarly toolkit for over 5 decades. It's not a collection of personal impressions. It's not storytelling for its own sake. It's a systematic inquiry. It holds that personal experience, when carefully and analytically examined, produces knowledge that other methods can't attain. It combines the rigor of academic inquiry with the depth of lived understanding, and it engages readers, not only their minds, but their imaginations. As both a writer and an artist, illustrated narrative autoethnography felt like a natural fit. When my supervisor encouraged me to write sample narratives to test the method, those narratives confirmed it. It was the right approach for the question I was asking. Again, in this thesis, my lived experience wasn't anecdotal. It was systematically examined, reflected upon, and analyzed alongside theories. Let me put the scope of this study in concrete terms because the numbers matter. Using the original Felitti Adverse Childhood Experience framework, roughly half of the children in an average classroom of 30 students will have experienced at least one ACE. That's 15 children. Of those, somewhere between 3 and 7 will have experienced 3 or more, and that's the point at which research consistently links ACEs to serious disruption in learning, behavioral problems, and long-term health problems. A word of clarification here. These figures count adverse effects, not confirmed trauma responses. Not every child who experiences an adverse childhood experience will develop trauma. Protective factors, supportive relationships, and individual resilience all influence how a child responds. But the numbers tell us that the conditions for trauma are present in virtually every classroom, and that's reason enough to be prepared. When we apply expanded frameworks that include poverty, racism, community violence, bullying, and pandemic-related disruptions, estimates in high-needs communities suggest that 7 to 24 of those same 30 children might be affected. In some classrooms, that's nearly every kid in the room. It doesn't stop at the classroom door. In a school of 100 staff members, roughly 50 have experienced at least one ACE, and between 10 and 20 have experienced 3 or more. These figures are extrapolated from national prevalence data, not direct classroom studies, but they're close enough to the truth to demand our attention. The COVID-19 lockdowns deepened all of this. Of the children in your future classrooms, the parents you'll speak with, the colleagues and administrators you'll work alongside, many of them are still holding what those years did. Trauma isn't a historical category. It's present tense. So that's the context. Now let's talk about design, how the study was built, and why every choice made was the right one for this question. Research questions evolve. This one did. It began as a question about what happened to me. Then it changed to a prescribed way to show what educators can do in the classroom. Finally, it became a question about what educators can learn from rigorous, illustrated, and critically reflective inquiry. That shift itself was methodologically significant. When the analytic work moved from documenting lived experience to examining illustrated narrative autoethnographic reflection as a method that deepens professional understanding, the question became sharper and its implications broader. This question isn't just about me, it's about what the methodology produces and what that means for the educators, the classrooms, and the children who will be taught by the professionals sitting in a room like this one. The question is, how can critical reflection deepen professional understanding of trauma, neural development, resilience, and trauma-informed practice with children? Illustrated narrative autoethnography sits at the intersection of qualitative and arts-based research. That combination wasn't accidental. Each element was chosen because the research question demanded it. The written narratives gave me a way to examine how my childhood adversity affected my learning, identity, and professional practice. But these aren't memoirs. They were constructed, revisited, and analyzed in dialogue with theory. The illustrations worked alongside the writing. They gave me access to emotional and embodied knowledge that language alone couldn't always account for, particularly when the memories involved trauma, where experience is often felt before it can be articulated. Reflective analysis connected the two, but I want to be clear about what I mean by that because there's an important distinction. Reflection is the act of looking at experience and making sense of it, what happened, and then what could have been done differently. Critical reflection goes further. It requires examination not only of what happened, but the assumptions and belief that colored how it was experienced, and then holding those up against what research actually tells us. In this thesis, that meant taking a memory, moving past the emotional surface, and asking what trauma theory, developmental psychology, and educational research could reveal about what that experience represented. Together, these three elements allowed the research to honor the full weight of memory while remaining analytically grounded. Illustrated autoethnography is grounded in an interpretivist worldview. Meaning isn't universal or fixed. It's informed by experience, reflection, and context. Take trauma as an example. How it's perceived and remembered depends entirely on when it happened, where it happened, and who lived it. That's why context isn't background detail in this research. It's central to the analysis. Interpretivist research doesn't try to eliminate subjectivity. It examines it openly. In this study, I made my position as researcher transparent so that readers could follow exactly how meaning was constructed and why. That has direct implications for your own work as future educators. The knowledge you build about your students doesn't come from keeping your distance. It comes from building relationships and paying attention and knowing context. Detachment isn't objectivity. Knowing your students well and knowing yourself well enough to understand how you see them is where real insight begins. The narratives and illustrations in this thesis aren't interpreted impressionistically. They're interpreted through a clear theoretical scaffold chosen for its explanatory power in relation to the research question. Trauma and resilience theory frames how early adversity influences behavior, learning, and identity. It treats trauma as context rather than as a permanent flaw in the child. And that distinction matters enormously in how we understand and respond to children in our classrooms. Social emotional learning, mindfulness, and executive functioning frameworks explain how children can develop the regulatory and reflective capacities that support learning, even when early experiences have been disruptive. Human development and motivation theory provides an additional lens for understanding growth agency, and identity formation across the lifespan. In qualitative work, theories guide interpretation. They ensure that what emerges from lived experience is placed in conversation with what research already knows, strengthening both the credibility of the method and the relevance of the findings. This thesis follows a clear line. A child who lived through adversity, an educator who spent 4 decades trying to understand it, and a scholar who's now naming it with the full weight of theory and evidence behind her. I drew on memory, observation, conversation, photographs, and academic resources. These data sources were triangulated against one another to produce findings that are honest, rich, and educationally transferable. The autoethnographic method allowed me to bring a perspective that no other researcher has, and that's my own. At the same time, it required that I remain vigilant about bias because the same proximity that enables death can distort analysis. Reflexivity is the discipline that holds that tension in check. My methodology is built on a conceptual paradigm, a framework that serves as a roadmap for the research. It outlines the connections between the dimensions of human experience that I was studying. So positionality gives that framework its grounding. It's from within my own standpoint, my history, my privileges, my perspectives, that I constructed my research lens. In autoethnography, I'm both the researcher and the participant. That dual role is what makes this methodology distinct and what makes the critical reflexivity we discussed earlier not optional, but essential. This thesis is built from 4 interrelated data strands, each essential and none sufficient on its own. Narrative vignettes provide the written core. They're accounts of formative experiences examined analytically. Illuminated letters are the visual data, original illustrations that function simultaneously as an image, an interpretation, and an argument. Reflective analysis links the narrative and visual data to educational theory. Photographs provide corroboration and context. Data selection in autoethnographic research requires explicit justification. These were the 4 criteria I applied. First person. The data had to be lived experience, not another's account. Emotional relevance. It had to be significant enough to sustain meaningful reflection. Ethical shareability. Given that other people appear in these memories, I was bound to represent them with discretion, telling my story and not theirs. Visual representability. The experience had to be translatable into both written and illustrated form, since the method required both. This isn't intuitive data selection. It's principled, transparent, and traceable. Memory doesn't record. It reconstructs. It's tempered by emotion, by time, and by what has been learned since the original experience. So in this study, memory's evolution isn't treated as an error. It's treated as data. Emotional truth, what an experience felt like, what it meant, and what it left behind is a legitimate form of knowledge, particularly when studying trauma. Children often can't describe what they are experiencing, but they feel it. Triangulation across narrative, illustration, photographs, and conversations with people from my childhood supports the credibility of what memory produces. No single source stands alone. This is one of the most significant methodological claims in this thesis, so I want to be precise about it. The illuminated letters aren't supplementary to the written narratives. They're epistemologically necessary. They carry analytical work that words can't perform, particularly when the memories in question are pre-verbal or when the emotional weight of an experience exceeds what a child or youth can articulate. Images reach the embodied dimensions of trauma. They make visible the relational and symbolic dimensions of an experience. They remove some of the emotional load from the reader, allowing engagement with difficult content without overwhelming. In the thesis, each illustration functions simultaneously as data, interpretation, and aesthetic inquiry. That triple function is what makes illustrated autoethnography a genuinely distinct methodological contribution. In autoethnographic research, the researcher is the primary tool of inquiry. That means the same rigor applied to any research instrument applied to me. My limitations, my perspectives, and my blind spots all require documentation. Reflexivity means ongoing, critical self-examination, not as confession, but as analysis. It means asking at every stage, how is my history influencing what I notice? How are my assumptions inflecting my interpretation? How has my understanding evolved as the writing progressed? There were moments in this thesis when revisiting certain memories was genuinely painful. I want to name that directly because it's part of the data. The discomfort of that process and the growth that followed were themselves evidence of the methodology working as it should. Over time, the distance created by education and professional experience, mindfulness practice, and social-emotional skill development determined what I could see and say. That evolution would be documented in this thesis, and it is in itself a finding. Gathering the data meant identifying the experiences most relevant to the research question. My supervisor asked me to begin with narratives of my childhood and youth, the choice of which experiences to include was mine. I wanted the writing to be clear and emotive, to speak to my family's generational trauma, and to provide a vignette of childhood experience spanning roughly each year of my early life. This was more challenging than I'd anticipated. This thesis addresses abuse and neglect I experienced as a child. Anyone who chooses autoethnography needs to be prepared for how emotionally demanding that process could be. So as I was developing a narrative of my story, I will read to you a little bit about what I wrote. I was an invisible child born in 1960, Caucasian, lower middle class, with 2 parents and 3 siblings. I grew up in a cosmopolitan Canadian city, and I moved to a distant town when I was 13. Normal, and yet I wasn't. I looked like all the other kids in my neighborhood and classes, but no one knew why I was so small, so sickly, so fearful, and so quiet. I was able to hide my anxiety and sadness in a kindergarten class with 27 students. I couldn't articulate why I was withdrawn and disengaged from other children and activities. I was reticent to ask my teachers for help, so I was one of those children who fell through the cracks. So you can see this can be a bit of a process to lay your soul out there and then to have to analyze it. This is one of my illuminated letters. It illustrates the letter I, and it was taken directly from my thesis as primary data. Beside it is a page from my appendix. The first column names each visual element in the illustration. The second one describes it, and the third one explains its significance to the thesis argument. This table demonstrates the analytical rigor in my visual data. Every symbolic choice in every illustration was documented, justified, and connected to the research. Nothing was decorative. I also corroborated my narratives by contacting people from my childhood who could confirm my account. That human verification was an important layer of credibility in a study built on my memories. This is my multimodal coding table. It shows how meaning was generated across the three data sources simultaneously: a narrative, an illustration, and a photograph, all connected to the same moment in my childhood. Each row moves through 4 stages of analysis. Open and inductive coding describes what's observable in the data. Focused and deductive coding identifies the deeper analytic patterns. Interpretive coding reveals the emotional themes. And the final column names the overarching theme that those 3 sources produce together. What I want you to notice is that the narrative, the illustration, and the photograph tell the same story in 3 different separate registers. The narrative describes an invisible child. The illustration renders that invisibility symbolically. And the photograph shows 2 little girls posed to present happiness with underlying disconnection visible if you know how to look. None of those sources is sufficient alone. Together, they produce something that neither words nor images or photographs could generate independently. That's triangulation. And that's how rigor was built into this methodology. The analytic process followed an inductive logic. Meaning was generated from the data, not tested against pre-existing hypotheses. I began by coding narratives and visual data, identifying recurring elements, tensions, and turning points. Those codes were clustered into patterns, and patterns were examined in relation to the theoretical frameworks I'd established. This produced 4 themes: trauma-informed classrooms and schools, critical reflection of educators, neural development and health, and building resilience through mindfulness, social-emotional learning, executive functioning, and other protective factors. Those 4 themes didn't come from theory imposed at the start. They emerged from the data itself. That's the distinction between inductive and deductive research, and it's central to understanding why this methodology produced the findings that it did. Rigor in qualitative research isn't achieved through a single strategy. It's built from multiple sources working together. In this study, again, that meant triangulating across the 4 data forms: the narratives, the illustrations, photographs, and conversations with people from my childhood who could corroborate my account. It meant independent coding, where patterns I identified were reviewed critically against another reader's analysis. And it meant ongoing supervisory review, which provided the distance I couldn't generate alone. It also meant adapting PRISMA principles, and I'll tell you what those are, to document the full methodological pathway transparently. Each of these strategies addressed a different potential weakness in the research. Together, they ensured that the findings were defensible, traceable, and grounded in the data rather than in assumption. PRISMA stands for Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analysis. It was originally developed for health research. Its core tools are a 27-item checklist and a flow diagram. They translate directly into qualitative work when adapted thoughtfully. PRISMA asks 3 fundamental questions. Why was the research done? What did the researcher do? And what did they find? Those questions are just as relevant to autoethnographic inquiry as they are to a clinical trial. In this thesis, I adapted PRISMA's checklist and flow diagram to document decisions underpinning data inclusion and exclusion, the organization of the 4 data strands, and the progression from raw material to thematic interpretation. It doesn't function as a rigid checklist. It functions as a guiding logic, one that allowed my supervisor and my readers to follow the methodological pathway clearly and critically. That adaptation in itself is a contribution to the field. It offers a model for how arts-based researchers can demonstrate rigor in terms that scholarly audiences recognize and trust. Adapting PRISMA in education is an option, not a requirement. it does involve significant extra work. This is my modified Prisma 2020 checklist, adapted specifically for arts-based autoethnographic research. It's a work in progress. Prisma was originally designed for systematic reviews in health research. It provides a structured checklist and the flow diagram that allows researchers and examiners to follow exactly what the researcher did, why certain data was included or excluded, and how the study was organized from beginning to end. I adapted it here to fit the nature of this inquiry. You can see I'm working on having it cover the same essential ground, the titles, the abstract, the introduction, and the methodology, but the checklist items have been rewritten to reflect autoethnographic data sources, narrative and visual inquiry, researcher positionality, and trauma-informed frameworks. The last column, marked with a checkmark or NA, shows my supervisor and my examiner precisely which items were addressed and which weren't addressed. That's the transparency. That's traceability. And in a methodology built on lived experience, that level of accountability matters enormously. I also want to say something practical to those of you planning your own thesis. There's a lot you won't know about the research process until you're in it. Prisma gives you a set of steps to follow from the start, and I wished I'd begun using it earlier. At this point, I'm not backtracking to recreate every decision I made along the way. I'm using it to move forward, which is why it's still a work in progress. When you are modifying the checklist, you can't just change elements of it. You have to change it and then give the reason for your change. And that in itself takes a bit of time. This is my modified Prisma flow diagram, adapted from the standard systematic review template to fit arts-based autoethnographic inquiry. Where the original Prisma flow diagram tracks the identification, screening, and inclusion of published studies, this version tracks the flow of my own research process, from the initial conceptual rationale through the data generation, theme development, reference collection, screening, and finally writing. Again, this is a work in progress. Each column shows what happened at each stage, what was included, what was set aside, and why. That's the inclusion and exclusion logic that Prisma requires, applied here to the narratives, illustrations, and photographs, and the literature, rather than to clinical trials. Autoethnographic studies in our institution, Ontario Tech U, doesn't require an application to an ethics review board because the researcher is the participant and the risk of harm falls primarily on the researcher themselves. That procedural exemption didn't reduce ethical responsibility for me. To me, it intensified it. In this thesis, I was bound by a personal commitment to tell only my story, to represent others with fairness and care, and to protect the identities of those whose lives intersected with mine, and to approach the memories of people who are no longer living with respect. Now, I want to say something specific to those of you who are teaching or planning to teach in Ontario. You are mandated reporters. The moment you have reasonable grounds to suspect that a child may be in need of protection, you're legally obligated to report to the Children's Aid Society. Not to investigate, not to confirm, just to report. That obligation doesn't wait for certainty. Before you make the call, let your principal know. They've been through this before and they'll want to support you, and you don't have to navigate the process alone. In trauma-informed schools, no one faces that responsibility in isolation. That's what it means to build a community of care. Every methodology has strengths. Every methodology has limits. The difference between good scholarship and great scholarship is the willingness to name both clearly. What follows isn't a defense of my choices, it's an honest account of what this method does well and where that ends. Illustrated autoethnography does three things particularly well. First, it goes deep. It can hold complexity and contradiction and ambiguity without flattening them into categories. That matters when the subject is trauma, which is rarely straightforward. Second, it's authentic. It represents experience honestly and completely in ways that surveys and statistical models simply can't. It gives voice to knowledge that other methods overlook. Third, it's practical. Because the data comes from educational experience and is analyzed through educational theory, the findings connect directly to classroom practice. This isn't research that sits on a shelf. It's got pedagogical transfer. And some limitations to think about. Subjectivity enables depth, but it also limits scope. This is one person's experience grounded in a particular history, a particular culture, and a particular moment in time. That's not a flaw, but it's a boundary that may not be right for you. The historical and cultural reach of the study is bounded by a single life. What I lived in Canada in the second half of the 20th century won't map directly onto every classroom or every community. I began this presentation by acknowledging that knowledge grows from particular places and particular lives. This research is an example of exactly that. At its foundation is an act of care. Care for the children in classrooms across the country right now who have big feelings they can't yet name, and care for the educators who will face them, who don't need just strategies but the understanding to use them well. What this methodology produces isn't certainty or a formula. It's a deeper, more honest way of seeing the children in front of us, and from that understanding, 2 original contributions to the field. This thesis introduces 2 original contributions that didn't exist in the literature before this work. The first is Prequip, a pedagogical framework for equipping children with the cognitive and emotional habits they'll need before adversity arrives, not in its aftermath. The goal isn't to wait for the crisis, it's to prepare the children before it comes. The second is the ALE framework, Adverse Lived Experiences. It extends the adverse childhood experiences model beyond childhood, recognizing that adversity doesn't end at 18. The emerging adults in your classrooms, your graduate students, your student teachers, may themselves be arriving with unresolved trauma that affects how they learn, how they teach, and how they relate to the children in their care. Beyond original contributions, this thesis advances 3 existing conversations in the field. First, it demonstrates that art-based autoethnographic research can meet the standards of scholarly rigor. That demonstration matters because it expands what counts as legitimate evidence in educational research, and it opens space for scholars whose knowledge lives in experience, image, and reflection. Second, it offers a Prisma adaptation that other qualitative researchers can use to document their methodological pathways transparently. That's a practical tool the field can build on. Prisma is written under a Creative Commons license. That means it's available for you to modify as you need. Third, it advances trauma-informed pedagogy by showing how critical reflective practice, grounded in lived experience and analyzed through theory, deepens professional understanding in ways that workshops and policy documents alone can't achieve. This methodology doesn't offer certainty. It doesn't offer a formula. What it does offer is something more durable than either, a way of seeing children that begins with honesty and ends with understanding. I want to thank you for listening to my presentation on autoethnography, and you can check me out at Marsh Education and at wendyfmarsh.com. Thanks. See you next time.